The morning of the wedding, the sky over Caldwell Flats turned the color of old bone. It wasn't a good sign. Not that anyone in town had expected this to be a good day, not for Ethan Calloway, not for Mara Whitlock, and certainly not for the two of them together. The whole county had been talking about this arrangement for 3 weeks running, in barbershops and dry goods stores, and at the long tables inside Danner's saloon, where men gathered after sundown to repeat what they'd already said a dozen times, because saying it again felt like entertainment. The story, as most people told it, was simple. Silas Granger had given Ethan Calloway a choice, and it wasn't much of a choice at all. Ethan had known trouble was coming since February, when the creek that fed the southern pasture of his ranch ran dry for the first time in 11 years. He'd drilled a secondary well and watched it spit dust. He'd sold 24 head of cattle to cover the spring payment on his operating loan, and then the late frost had killed off half his winter wheat. By April, he owed Granger Land and Livestock Holdings the better part of $400, and he didn't have $400. He had a horse, a working dog with a torn ear, and about 60 acres of sun-cracked grassland that hadn't been worth a serious man's attention in going on 2 seasons. Silas Granger's man, a thin-necked fellow named Pruitt, who wore his hat too far back on his head and always seemed to be smiling about something private, had ridden out to the Calloway place on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. He'd sat on his horse in the yard while Ethan stood on the porch, and he delivered the message the way a man delivers a bill he already knows can't be paid. "Mr. Granger is prepared to extend your loan," Pruitt said. "Restructure the terms. Give you another full year before the first payment comes due." Ethan had looked at him. "And what does Granger want for that?" Pruitt smiled. "He wants you to marry Mara Whitlock." The silence that followed was long enough that Ethan's dog padded over from the shade of the barn and sat beside him, as if sensing that something was happening that required witnesses. "Excuse me?" Ethan said. "Miss Whitlock. You know her, I imagine." He did. Everyone in Caldwell Flats knew Mara Whitlock, though most of them would have preferred not to. She was 31 years old, the daughter of the late Franklin Whitlock, who had run the county land registry office for 2 decades before dying of a stroke at his desk 3 years prior. She was large-framed and plain-faced and wore her dark hair in a severe knot at the back of her head because she'd given up on the idea of it behaving otherwise. She walked with her shoulders pulled back and her chin slightly forward, and she had a habit of looking directly at people when they spoke to her, not in a rude way, just in a way that made some men uncomfortable, as if she was actually listening instead of waiting for her turn to respond. The town had been unkind to her for as long as Ethan could remember. It had started in her school years when the other girls had decided she was strange and the boys had agreed because it was easier. It had continued into her adulthood when she'd taken work as a bookkeeper for 3 different businesses in town, and 2 of those businesses had quietly let her go after their wives complained about having a woman like that handling the accounts. She lived alone in the house her father had left her, at the north end of Birch Street, and she kept a small garden and did work for whoever would have her, and did not appear, as far as Ethan had ever observed, to spend much time feeling sorry for herself. He didn't know her well. He'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with her over the years, a greeting here, a transaction at the mercantile there. He had no opinion of her beyond the vague sense that the town had been meaner to her than she deserved. "Why?" Ethan said. That was the question that mattered. Not whether he'd do it. Not yet. Just why. Pruitt lifted one shoulder. "Mr. Granger has his reasons. I'd like to hear them." "That's not part of the offer, Mr. Calloway." Ethan stood on his porch and looked out at his dry pasture and his leaning fence line and the barn roof that needed re-shingling before another winter came through, and he thought about the ranch that his father had built, and that his father's father had found the land for, and that was, by any honest accounting, about 6 months away from belonging to Silas Granger. "Tell Mr. Granger I'll need a few days," he said. Pruitt nodded and turned his horse around. "Don't take too many," he said over his shoulder. "The offer has a shelf, so." Ethan rode into town the next morning and found Mara Whitlock in her garden, pulling weeds from around the base of a tomato plant with the focused expression of someone solving a problem that genuinely interested her. He stood at the gate for a moment before she looked up. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Not surprised, not unwelcoming, just acknowledging. "Miss Whitlock." He took his hat off. "I wonder if I could speak with you for a few minutes." She looked at him steadily. About Granger's offer. He blinked. You already know. Pruitt came to see me first, she said. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands on her work apron. Come inside if you want to talk. I'll put coffee on. Her kitchen was small and clean and smelled like dried herbs and something savory that had been cooked recently. She moved around it without hurry, filling the pot, setting cups on the table, and Ethan sat in the chair she'd gestured toward and held his hat in his hands and tried to find a way to begin that didn't feel insulting. I don't know what Granger told you, he started. He told me the same thing he told you, Mara said, that he'd extend your loan if you agreed to marry me. He told me it was a generous arrangement and that I should be grateful for the opportunity. She said the last part flatly, without particular emotion, as if reciting something she'd already decided not to believe. What did you tell him? I told him I'd consider it. She poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. I've been considering it since yesterday. Ethan wrapped his hands around the cup. It was warm, and he appreciated that. And? I have some questions, Mara said, about what you'd actually want from this. Not what Granger wants. What you want. He looked at her. She was watching him in that direct way she had, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it didn't make him uncomfortable. It felt more like being taken seriously than being examined. I want to keep my ranch, he said. Honest, because she seemed like someone who could tell the difference. It was my father's. I know that's not a romantic reason to propose marriage to a woman. It's an honest reason, Mara said. That counts for something. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I have questions about what this would actually look like. Day to day? Whether you'd expect a wife in the traditional sense, or a woman who keeps to one side of the house and you keep to the other, or something else entirely. Ethan hadn't thought through it that carefully. He said so. Then think about it now, Mara said, because I won't go into something like this without understanding what I'm agreeing to. He thought about it. He thought about it for long enough that the coffee got lukewarm and the morning light shifted across the kitchen floor. And then he said, I think what I'd want is a partner, someone who's pulling in the same direction. I'm not looking to own you, Miss Whitlock, and I'm not looking to put you in a corner. He paused. Though I should tell you that the ranch is in bad shape, I'm not offering you comfort. Mara nodded slowly. I've lived in my father's house for 3 years on what I could earn doing other people's ledger work. I'm not expecting comfort. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be honest with you about something. All right. I think Silas Granger arranged this because he believes it will humiliate both of us. He thinks you'll resent me, or I'll resent you, or the two of us together will be so miserable that we'll fall apart and he can pick up whatever's left. She looked at him without blinking. I think that's the actual reason, not generosity, strategy. Ethan sat with that. It had the ring of truth to it. Granger wasn't a generous man. Everything he did was calculated, and he didn't give things away without getting something back that was worth considerably more. Then what do we do about that? Ethan said. Mara set her cup down. We prove him wrong, she said, simply, like it was the obvious answer, shouts. They were married on the 14th of May in the First Presbyterian Church on Caldwell Street, and the pews were full. Not full in the way pews were full for a beloved couple, with family in the front rows and friends crammed together and flower arrangements someone had spent real effort on. Full in the way a town square fills when there's something ugly to watch. People had come from as far as the Harmon settlement 8 miles east and the Decker homestead south of the creek, and they crowded into the church with the buzzing, particular energy of an audience that has already decided how the performance will go. Ethan arrived from the south end of the street. He'd brushed his best coat 3 times that morning, and the dust had come out of it reasonably well. His boots were polished. He'd trimmed his beard. He walked up the church steps with his hat in his hand, and he could hear the murmur that ran through the gathered crowd on the lawn. And he kept his eyes forward and his jaw set, and did not give anyone the satisfaction of watching him hesitate. Inside the church, Mara was already there. She was standing near the front with old Clara Henning, the seamstress who'd made the alterations on her dress as a business transaction, not as friendship, beside her. The dress was dark blue wool, practical, and it fit her well. She had her hair in its usual knot, but with 2 small combs at the sides that Ethan suspected she'd put in that morning as a concession to the occasion. She was looking at the far wall, and her expression was the one she always seemed to have, composed and slightly watchful, like someone who had decided a long time ago not to let her face tell other people's stories for them. When Ethan walked down the aisle, the whispering in the pews rose and then settled. He heard a few words clearly, "Poor devil," and "What a pair," and "Granger really did it this time." And he let them wash past him without looking toward their sources. He reached the front and stopped beside Mara, and she turned to look at him. "You came," she said quietly. Not relieved, more like someone checking a fact. "Told you I would," he said. "People say a lot of things." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I'm here." The minister, a young man named Ashford, who had the permanently anxious look of someone who suspected he'd chosen the wrong profession, cleared his throat and opened his book. Someone in the back pews laughed at something. The sound was brief but sharp, and Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He turned around. The pews were full of people who had come for entertainment. He recognized most of them, ranchers and shopkeepers and their wives, and the loafers who spent their afternoons in the saloon. Some of them had the decency to look slightly ashamed when he turned. Most of them did not. He looked at them for a long moment. Just looked. And then he said, in a voice that carried clearly to the back of the church, "I want to say something before we start." Minister Ashford froze with his book half open. "I know why most of you are here," Ethan said, "and I know what you expected to see today. You thought you'd see two people who couldn't do better being pushed together by somebody else's plan, and you were going to take that home with you and feel better about yourselves for a week." He paused. "I'm going to disappoint you." The church was very quiet now. Mara Whitlock is a capable woman who has been treated poorly by this town for a long time, and that says a great deal more about this town than it does about her. I'm standing here because I choose to be. He glanced sideways at Mara, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "That's all I wanted to say." He turned back to the minister. Ashford blinked twice. Then he cleared his throat again and began. "Awesome." In the third pew from the back, Silas Granger sat with his arms crossed and his hat on his knee and watched all of this with the particular stillness of a man who does not like surprises. He was 62 years old, broad in the chest and thick in the neck. With white hair he kept cut close and pale gray eyes that had a way of making people feel they were being sorted rather than looked at. He had come to Caldwell Flats 20 years ago with money that nobody had ever satisfactorily accounted for, and he had built Granger land and livestock holdings into the dominant economic force in the county through a combination of sharp dealing, strategic generosity, and a legal team in Tucson that was considerably better than anything the local ranchers could afford. He owned 6,000 acres outright. He held mortgages or operating loans on another 12,000. He employed 40 men directly and had financial relationships with 3 times that many. He sat on the board of the county water authority and had significant influence over who the county appointed as land registrar, a position that had been considerably less rigidly administered since Franklin Whitlock died. He had arranged this marriage because Mara Whitlock was a problem. She didn't know she was a problem yet. She was just a woman doing bookkeeping and living in her dead father's house. But Silas had made his fortune by identifying problems before they identified him, and Mara Whitlock had her father's mind for numbers and her father's access to certain documents that Franklin had kept, improperly, from Silas's perspective, in the house rather than in the official registry. And she was the kind of woman who, given enough time and the right circumstances, might one day start looking at those documents and understand what she was looking at. Better to keep her close. Better to have her entangled in a failing marriage to a struggling rancher, occupied with the grinding business of day-to-day survival, distracted from anything more dangerous. Better to have her broken down by poverty than sharpened by too much quiet time. That had been the plan. Watching Ethan Calloway stand up in the front of that church and say what he'd just said, Silas felt something he was not accustomed to feeling, not quite worry, something adjacent to it. He sat with his arms crossed and watched the minister pronounce them married, and he watched Ethan take Mara's hand and the two of them turn to face the congregation, and he watched the people in the pews go entirely silent because they hadn't expected that either, and he thought, I may have miscalculated on the man. He would not make the same mistake about the woman. They drove back to the ranch in Ethan's wagon, with the dog, whose name was Fletcher, trotting alongside in the dust. The afternoon had turned hot, and the road out of town was long, and neither of them said much for the first mile or so. Then Mara said, "You didn't have to do that." "Do what?" "Say what you said, in the church." She was looking at the road ahead. It wasn't part of any arrangement. Ethan kept his hands on the reins. "I know. It'll make people angry. Some of them. People don't like being called out in public." "I expect not." Mara was quiet. Then, "Why did you?" He thought about it. He wasn't given to big explanations. He'd never been the kind of man who talked easily about his reasons for things. But she'd asked directly, and she deserved a direct answer. "Because somebody should have said it a long time ago," he said. "And because I meant it. And because if we're going to try to make something out of this situation, I didn't want to start it by standing there and letting them laugh." She didn't say anything for a while after that. When they came over the low rise and the Callaway Ranch spread out below them, the small house, the large barn, the fence lines that needed mending, the dry south pasture, all of it sun-bleached and slightly tired-looking in the late afternoon light, Ethan glanced at her to see what she'd make of it. Mara looked at it steadily, the way she seemed to look at everything, without flinching from the reality of it, but without particular despair either. She was taking inventory. He could almost see her doing it. "The south pasture," she said. "Creek ran dry in February." "And the well?" "Went dry trying to supplement. I drilled a second one, but it's weak. I've been hauling water from the north well for the kitchen garden." She nodded. "What's the current balance on the loan?" $420. Granger's restructured it. Year's grace on the first payment. After that, it's on a monthly schedule with interest." "What's the interest rate?" He told her. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's not a standard rate." "I know." "Did you read the contract carefully?" He paused. "I read it." Mara looked at him sideways. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, more like the look of someone who has found exactly what they expected and isn't pleased to be right. "I'd like to read it," she said. "All right." She looked back at the ranch spread below them. "All right," she echoed. And then she picked up the small bag she'd brought with her, one bag, neatly packed, and held it in her lap for the rest of the drive down. The first weeks were harder than either of them admitted to the other. The house had 2 small bedrooms, and Mara took the one that had been used for storage, clearing it out herself without asking for help, and setting it up with a practical efficiency that suggested she was accustomed to making the best of whatever space she was given. She cooked in the mornings before the heat built up, and Ethan worked outside from first light until the day got too brutal to sustain it. They ate their meals at the kitchen table without much conversation at first. Not hostile silence, just the silence of 2 people who were still taking each other's measure and hadn't found the rhythm of talking yet. Fletcher decided he liked Mara on the 3rd day, following her around the yard and settling at her feet in the evenings, which Ethan noticed without comment. By the 2nd week, she had found the loan contract. She hadn't asked him to find it. She'd simply, quietly, located where he kept his papers, in a wooden box on the shelf above the fireplace, and sat down at the kitchen table one evening after supper with the contract and a lamp and a pencil and a piece of scratch paper. And she worked through it with the focused, unhurried attention of someone to whom numbers were a language rather than an obstacle. Ethan watched her from across the room, where he was working on a piece of harness leather that needed restitching. He watched her make small marks on the scratch paper and go back through the contract and make more marks. After about an hour, she said, "Ethan?" It was the first time she'd used his first name. He looked up. "Come look at this," she said. He set down the harness and came to the table. She had the contract spread out and the scratch paper beside it, covered in her small, precise handwriting and columns of figures. "This clause," she said, pointing, "on the restructured terms. It reads like a standard interest adjustment, but look at how the base amount is calculated." She traced the language with her finger. "They've included a compounding mechanism that isn't disclosed anywhere in plain language. It's buried in the reference to the appendix, and the appendix uses terms that aren't defined in the main document." She looked up at him. "Do you know what this means for your balance in month 13, when the first payment comes due?" He looked at the figures on her scratch paper, looked at them again. "That can't be right," he said. "I've checked it 3 times, Mara said. "The balance in month 13, with the compounding they've hidden here, is not $420. It's closer to $700. The lamp flame bent slightly in a draft from the window. Outside, a night bird called once and went quiet. He'd foreclose immediately, Ethan said. He wasn't asking. The moment you miss the first payment, Mara said. Which, at this rate, you would. She looked back at the contract. I don't think this was an extension, Ethan. I think this was a trap with extra steps. He sat down in the chair across from her. He was quiet for a while, the way he got quiet when something shifted and he needed to let his thinking settle around the new shape of things. How did you see that? He said finally. In those terms, Mara looked at him. My father ran the county land registry for 20 years, she said. He brought work home every night. I grew up at the table while he went through documents. After a while, you learn what language looks like when it's hiding something. She paused. He always said the most dangerous sentence in a legal contract was the one that seems to say something simple. Ethan looked at the contract, then at her scratch paper, then back at her. Is this the only contract like this? He said. Something shifted in Mara's expression, a calculation he couldn't fully read. That, she said slowly, is exactly the right question. She spent the next 2 weeks finding the answer. Ethan let her go through his papers completely and didn't ask about what she was doing, partly because he trusted her, and partly because he sensed she needed the space to work without being watched. She made trips into town, to the county courthouse, to the small public library, to the offices of the Caldwell Flats Courier where they kept back issues for 3 years. And she came back each time with more scratch paper covered in figures, and her expression set in the particular way it got when she was running something to ground. On a Saturday morning in the 3rd week after the wedding, she came into the barn where Ethan was patching a section of roof, and she stood below him with a folder of papers under her arm and said, Ethan, I need to show you something. He came down from the ladder. They sat on the hay bales near the barn door, and she opened the folder and laid out what she'd found, piece by piece, in the methodical way she did everything. She had pulled 11 other operating loan contracts from the public court filings when borrowers had failed to pay and Granger had initiated foreclosure. She had gone through each of them with the same analysis she'd applied to Ethan's. 9 of the 11 had the same hidden compounding mechanism. It's not identical language in each one, she said. He's careful about that. Different phrasing, different placement, different appendix structures. But the mathematical effect is the same. She pointed to the names on the copies she'd made. The Harmon family, the Decker operation, the Villanueva brothers who lost their place 2 years ago. The Callaway name is going to be on this list too, unless something changes. Ethan looked at the names. He knew most of them. He'd been to the Harmon place for branding. He'd helped Roy Decker pull a calf 3 springs ago. How many people lost their land to him, he said. In the past 8 years? Based on what I can find publicly? 19 separate properties. Mara's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly. More like the cold clarity of someone who has identified something too large to look away from. And I think that's the visible part. Ethan set down the papers. Outside, Fletcher had found something interesting near the fence line and was investigating it with great personal investment. The morning was already getting hot. Mara, Ethan said, what are you thinking? She looked at him. I'm thinking that Silas Granger didn't arrange this marriage to embarrass us, she said. Or not only that. She paused. I think he arranged it because he knew my father kept copies of the original land survey maps from before Granger started buying. I think he's been worried about those maps for 3 years and he couldn't figure out how to get access to my father's house without raising suspicion. She held his gaze. I think he put me in a position where I'd be so busy trying to survive on a failing ranch that I'd never have time to look at what my father actually left me. The morning was very quiet for a moment. Did he get the maps? Ethan said. No, Mara said. I have them. I brought them with me. They're under the floorboard in my room. She said it simply, without drama. I've had them the whole time. I just hadn't known yet what I was looking for. Ethan looked at her. At this woman the town had laughed at, who had come to his failing ranch with one bag and her father's papers and her father's mind for language that hid things, and who had, in 3 weeks, found what Silas Granger had spent 3 years trying to bury. How bad is it? He said. If the maps say what you think they say. Mara looked down at the folder of papers. A muscle worked in her jaw. Bad enough, she said, that he cannot afford for us to still be standing in 6 months. She looked back up. Which means we need to move before he realizes we're not falling apart. Ethan nodded once, slowly. All right, he said. Tell me what you need. Mara looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated and human and not entirely easy to name. Something between relief and the caution of someone who has been let down before and is not yet ready to trust the feeling of not being let down. Time, she said, and someone who will back my word when the time comes. She paused. Can you do that? Ethan picked up the folder and handed it back to her. I was here before Pruitt showed up, he said. I'm still here now. That's my answer. She took the folder, held it against her chest. Outside, Fletcher abandoned whatever had interested him by the fence and trotted back toward the barn, his nails clicking on the dry ground. And the morning went on around them, hot and indifferent and full of the ordinary sounds of a working ranch. The creak of the gate, the distant cattle, the wind moving through the grass of the north pasture where the water still ran. Inside the barn is the particular quiet between two people who had just agreed to something larger than either of them had planned for. Mara Whitlock opened the folder again and turned to the next page, and Ethan Calloway leaned forward to look at what she was showing him. They had a great deal of work to do. The land surveys were old. That was the first thing Mara noticed when she spread them across the kitchen table the following morning, waited at the corners with a coffee cup, a jar of dried beans, and 2 flat stones Ethan had brought in from the yard without asking why she needed them. The paper was the heavy cream-colored stock the county had used before the war, soft at the folds from years of being stored flat, and the ink had faded to a warm brown that was still perfectly legible if you held the lamp close. Her father had made his own annotations in the margins. Small, precise notations in the same handwriting that had filled the household ledgers she'd grown up watching him keep. Dates, reference numbers. Occasionally a single word, check or discrepancy, or in one corner of the largest map, simply, how? Ethan sat across from her with his coffee and watched her work without interrupting. She had come to appreciate that about him in the 3 weeks since the wedding, his ability to be present without needing to fill the space with himself. A lot of men couldn't do that. This line, she said, and pointed to a boundary marking on the survey that covered the eastern section of the valley. Do you see how it runs? He leaned forward. Along the ridge as of 1871. She set her finger on a second survey, newer by about 12 years, that she'd pulled from the county courthouse filings. Look at the same boundary in 1883. He looked. He was quiet for a moment. That's not the same ridge, he said. No, Mara said. It's not. The 1883 survey moves the eastern boundary line about approximately 400 yards west of where the original placement puts it. She looked at him. 400 yards times the length of that property line. Do you know how many acres that represents? He did the rough math in his head. Close to 300. 280, she said. 280 acres that appear on the 1883 survey to belong to the parcel that Silas Granger purchased in 1884. She let that sit for a moment. The parcel that the Reyes family had worked for 11 years before the survey showed their boundary as considerably smaller than they'd believed, and they could no longer make the payments on a mortgage that was now calculated against land they suddenly didn't own. Ethan set his coffee cup down. The Reyes family, he said. Miguel Reyes. He left the county. Took his family south, I heard. Nobody knew quite why. I know why, Mara said. She didn't say it with satisfaction. She said it the way you say something when you've been following a trail and finally found where it leads, and the place it leads to is worse than you'd let yourself expect. She moved the surveys aside and picked up the folder of loan contracts she'd compiled the week before. Here's what I think happened, she said, and I want you to tell me if I'm wrong anywhere, because I could be wrong. Go ahead. Granger came into this county 20 years ago with capital and a plan. The plan was to acquire land, not to farm it or ranch it himself, to hold it, consolidate it, build a monopoly on water access and grazing rights that would make every other operation in the valley dependent on him in some form. She turned the folder over in her hands. Straightforward enough, plenty of men have done similar, but he wasn't satisfied with buying what people would sell. He wanted the properties that weren't for sale, the ones with history, the ones people would hold on to even when times got hard. So he made times harder, Ethan said. He made times harder, and he made the exits narrower. She opened the folder. The manipulated loan terms I found, they don't just overcharge. They're structured to produce a specific outcome. A borrower who can almost make the payments, who stays current long enough to believe they'll be fine, who then hits the compounding cliff at month 13 and is suddenly behind by an amount they cannot catch up to. She paused. And at that point, Granger offers to renegotiate. Except the renegotiation involves signing over a portion of the property as collateral, or accepting a boundary adjustment, or agreeing to a water rights modification that looks minor on paper. That's what happened to the Villanueva brothers, Ethan said slowly. They didn't lose the whole ranch at once. They lost it in pieces. Every 2-3 years, another piece. By the time it was fully his, they'd been renegotiating for a decade. And each renegotiation was a separate legal agreement, Mara said, clean on its face. No single document shows you what happened. You have to look at all of them together over time. She put the folder down, which is exactly what nobody has done until now. Because looking at them together requires pulling records from 3 different places, cross-referencing dates, and understanding enough about contract language to see what the terms actually do rather than what they appear to say. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the morning wind moved through the yard and Fletcher made a sound in his sleep from wherever he was sleeping. "Your father figured it out," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. Mara looked at the survey map with the marginal note that said "how" in her father's handwriting. "I think he was starting to," she said. "He died before he got far enough to act on it. Or maybe—" She stopped. "Maybe what?" She folded her hands on the table. "Maybe someone made sure the timing worked out that way. I don't know. I don't have any reason to believe that beyond the fact that my father was in reasonable health and then suddenly he wasn't." She looked up. "I'm not making accusations I can't support. I'm just saying I don't know." Ethan looked at her. Her face was very composed, the way it got when she was holding something down. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded once, accepted it without making more of it than it was. "What I do know," she said, "is that these surveys and these contracts together tell a story. And I think if we can get the right people to look at them, that story is going to be very hard for Silas Granger to answer." "The right people," Ethan said. "Who are we talking about?" "There's a land attorney in Harmon County named Birch," Mara said. "He handled a dispute between 2 homesteaders 3 years ago that went to the territorial court. He won. He's not connected to any of Granger's financial interests, as far as I can determine." She paused. "He's also expensive." Ethan looked at the table, at the surveys and the contracts and the scratch paper covered in Mara's handwriting. He looked at his hands, which were calloused from work that had not, in the past several years, produced proportional results. "How expensive?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's almost everything I'd get for the North Herd." "I know. If I sell the North Herd and the attorney takes the case and then can't make anything stick, then you've sold your North Herd and the ranch fails faster than it would have anyway," Mara said. "I know that too." She didn't soften it. She'd found that he didn't want things softened. He wanted to see the actual shape of the risk. "But here's what I also know. If we do nothing, you are going to miss the month 13 payment on this loan by a margin that cannot be explained away, and Granger will foreclose, and the ranch fails in any case. The only version of this story where the ranch doesn't fail is the one where we find a way to make his fraud visible before he has the legal standing to take this place." Ethan sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling, which had a water stain in one corner that he'd been meaning to deal with for 2 seasons. "We'd need more than just our contracts," he said. "One family's paperwork against a man with a legal team in Tucson." "Much more," Mara agreed. "We'd need testimony from other families who were affected, and they'd need to be willing to give it on record, not just privately." She paused. "Which means I need to talk to them." "They won't want to," Ethan said. "Those people have been trying to put this behind them. Some of them are gone entirely. The ones still in the county. They're scared of him. They've seen what happens when people push back." "I know," she said. "I'm not expecting it to be easy. It's not just difficult, Mara. Some of these families have children. Granger doesn't play gentlemanly when he feels threatened. He has enough influence with the county administration to make a man's life very uncomfortable without ever doing anything technically illegal." "I know what he can do," Mara said. Her voice was level but not cold. I grew up watching my father work in that building, dealing with the bureaucratic interference every time he tried to update records that didn't favor Granger's interests. I watched it frustrate him for years. I watched him try to work around it quietly because he didn't have the evidence he needed to go further. She looked at Ethan directly. I have the evidence he didn't have, and I'm not interested in working quietly. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. Something shifted between them slightly. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing you could point to and name, just a small, structural settling, like a beam finding its proper load. Okay. She started with the Harmon family because Ruth Harmon had been a schoolmate of Mara's for 3 years before the Harmon family moved to the Eastern Settlement, and because Ruth was the kind of woman who, once she decided something was right, did not require a great deal of convincing to act on it. Mara rode out on a Tuesday morning in early June, alone, on the older of Ethan's 2 horses. The ride was 8 miles on a road that was more suggestion than infrastructure, and the sun was already serious by the time she reached the Harmon place. Ruth met her at the gate with a look that was equal parts welcome and wariness. Mara Whitlock, she said, then correcting herself, Calloway, I heard you got married. I did, Mara said. Can I come in? Ruth let her in. They sat at the Harmon kitchen table, which was larger than the one at the Calloway ranch and surrounded by evidence of the 4 Harmon children who were currently, by the sound of it, engaged in something energetic somewhere out of sight. Ruth poured coffee and sat with both hands wrapped around her cup and listened while Mara laid out what she'd found. She didn't interrupt. That was one of the things Mara had always respected about Ruth. She actually listened, rather than assembling her response while the other person was still talking. When Mara finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. You can prove this, she said. Not just suspect it. I can show the mathematical effect of the contract terms, and I can show that the boundary on your original land grant doesn't match the boundary on the survey Granger used to justify your payment recalculation in 1887, Mara said. Whether that rises to the level of legal proof depends on an attorney. But yes, I believe it's provable. Ruth turned her coffee cup around in her hands. What do you need from us? A signed statement describing what happened with your loan and the boundary adjustment. Dates, amounts, what Granger's people told you when they came to discuss the renegotiation. Mara paused. I won't pretend there's no risk in giving that statement. There is. But I think the risk of not acting is larger, and I think if there are enough families willing to do this together, the exposure to any one family is smaller. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Henry's going to say no, she said. He spent 3 years getting past this. He doesn't want to pick at it. I know, I'm not asking Henry. I'm asking you. Mara held her gaze. You know your own situation better than I do, Ruth. I'm just asking you to think about it. Ruth thought about it. She looked at the kitchen around her. The curtains she'd made herself, the children's drawings pinned near the window, the list of supplies on the board by the door that had things crossed off it that wouldn't be replaced until the money allowed. She looked at all of it, and then she looked back at Mara. Give me until Friday, she said. Mara rode home with a small, carefully contained feeling of something that wasn't quite hope, but was adjacent to it. She spent the rest of June riding. She went to the Decker place and spent 3 hours with Clara Decker, who cried twice and then got very angry and then, at the end, wrote out a careful 2-page statement in her own handwriting and signed her name at the bottom with a firmness that left an impression in the paper. She went to the county courthouse 3 times and pulled additional filings and made copies in the reading room until the clerk started watching her with a complicated expression that suggested he wasn't sure whether to help her or send word to someone. She found 2 other families, the Okafor homestead north of town and a widow named Estelle Pratt, who had lost her late husband's property in 1886 under circumstances that, once Mara showed her the contract analysis, made Estelle Pratt's expression go very still and very cold. I thought we just couldn't manage, Estelle said, in a voice that had lost some of its evenness. I thought Henry hadn't been careful enough. I blamed him for years after he died. I thought we'd simply failed. Mara sat across from her and did not look away. You didn't fail, she said. The terms were designed to produce a specific outcome, regardless of how careful you were. Estelle was quiet for a long time. Then, where do I sign? Not everyone said yes. The Villanueva brothers, Carlos and Edmundo, heard Mara out at the gate of the farm they were sharecropping. They'd lost their own place 4 years ago and were working someone else's land now. And Carlos shook his head before she'd finished. "We have children," he said. "We have nothing left that Granger can take, but he can still make things very bad for us. I'm sorry, Mrs. Calloway. I'm sorry, but no." She didn't push him. She thanked him for his time and rode away, and she let herself feel the weight of it on the road home without pretending it didn't matter. When she got back, Ethan was at the fence line doing repairs, and he looked up when she rode in and read something in her face. "How many?" he said. "4 confirmed, 1 maybe, 2 no." He nodded, set down his fencing tool. "Is 4 enough?" "I don't know yet," she said. "It depends on what the attorney says, and on whether I can find the Reyes family." She dismounted and began loosening the saddle. "Miguel Reyes and his family went south. I've been trying to find an address." Ethan came over and took the horse's bridle without being asked, which she'd noticed he did sometimes, picked up the practical task without making it a gesture. "I knew a man who went south around the same time the Reyeses left," he said. "Might know where they settled. I can write to him." "Please," she said. He led the horse toward the water trough. Fletcher materialized from somewhere and fell into step beside him. "Ruth Harmon came by this afternoon while you were out," Ethan said. Mara looked at him. "And?" She brought a statement, 3 pages. He glanced back at her. "She said Henry doesn't know she came. Said to tell you she figured you'd been right about the risk." Mara stood in the yard for a moment with the saddle over her arm. "All right," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. She carried the saddle to the barn and hung it and stood in the cool dimness for a moment with her hand resting on the wooden rail, and she thought about her father and his marginal notations and the word how, written in a corner of a map that had been sitting under a floorboard for 3 years waiting for someone to look at it. She'd been looking at it. She went back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table and opened the folder and started on the next set of documents. The letter from Birch arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Ethan had written to him with a summary of what they had and what they needed. It was 2 pages, written in a clipped professional hand that spent very little time on pleasantries. He was interested. The evidence Ethan had described, if it held up to scrutiny, described a pattern of predatory contract fraud on a significant scale. He would need to review the original documents before committing to representation. He noted his retainer fee and his hourly rate and his expectation of a partial advance before travel. He noted, without particular drama, that cases of this nature, involving parties with significant local political influence, were not without personal risk to the attorney of record, and that he was accounting for this in his pricing. He closed by saying he could be in Caldwell Flats within the month, if they wished to proceed. Ethan read the letter at the table that evening and passed it to Mara without comment. She read it, looked at the fee numbers, looked at Ethan. "The North Herd," she said. "I'll sell them Saturday," he said. "Draper over in Mesa Wells will take them. Won't be full market price, but it'll be close enough." Mara set the letter down. She thought about what selling the North Herd meant for the ranch's operating capacity. She thought about the math of it, the shortfall it would create in their ability to carry any cattle through to the fall market. She thought about what happened to a ranch that couldn't stock its own pasture. "Ethan," she said, "I know. I need you to understand what we're doing. If this doesn't work, I understood what we were doing when we started," he said. He wasn't impatient about it. He just said it plainly, the way he said most things. "If we don't do something, we lose the ranch anyway. At least this way we're losing it trying to stop the man who set us up to lose it." Mara looked at him across the table. At his face, which was not a handsome face particularly, but was an honest one, with the particular weathered quality of a man who had spent his adult life working outdoors and who had not found that life easy and had not pretended otherwise. "I didn't expect this," she said. She wasn't sure exactly what she meant by it, and she thought he probably knew that, and he had the good sense not to ask her to explain. "No," he said. "Neither did I." He picked up the letter again and read Birch's address off the bottom of the page. "I'll write back tonight," he said. "Tell him to come." Mara pulled the folder toward her and opened it to the section where she'd been building the chronological record. Every contract, every survey discrepancy, every signed statement, laid out in order by date so that the full shape of what Granger had done would be legible to anyone who sat down with it. She had been thorough. She knew she had been thorough because her father had taught her that thorough was the only thing that stuck. That partial evidence didn't just fail to convict, it warned the other side about what you knew and gave them time to prepare. She had not warned Silas Granger about what she knew. She intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Outside, the summer dark had come down over the ranch, and the night was making its ordinary sounds. Insects, the cattle settling, the small creak of the fence in the west pasture where the wood was getting old. Ethan wrote his letter at the other end of the table, and the lamp sat between them and threw its light across the documents and the scratch paper and the surveys with her father's careful handwriting in the margins. They worked until the lamp oil got low, and then Ethan banked the stove, and Mara organized the papers back into their folder, and Fletcher came inside from his spot on the porch and settled on the floor near the door. It was an ordinary evening in its details. In what it meant, it was anything but. Neither of them said that. They didn't need to. Thomas Birch arrived on a Wednesday morning in late July, on the eastbound stage from Harmon County, and he was not what Ethan had pictured. Ethan had pictured someone older, heavier, perhaps, the kind of attorney who wore his success visibly and let it do his talking for him. What stepped off the stage instead was a man of about 45, lean and slightly stooped in the shoulders, with spectacles that needed adjusting and a traveling coat that had seen better years. He carried a worn leather satchel in one hand and a battered hat in the other, and he stood on the Caldwell Flats Main Street and looked around at it with the calm, unhurried assessment of someone who has walked into difficult places before and found them survivable. Ethan introduced himself. Birch shook his hand with a firm, dry grip. "Your wife's summary letter," Birch said, before Ethan had found his way to the next sentence. "She has a precise mind. I'd like to meet her." "She's at the ranch," Ethan said. "She didn't want to come into town for this." Birch looked at him over the spectacles. "Sensible," he said. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately before we go?" They went to the back room of the feed store, where Dan Aldrich, who owed Ethan a favor from a winter 3 years past, when Ethan had helped pull his wagon out of a ditch in a freezing rainstorm, let them use the small office without asking questions. Birch sat with his satchel on the table and his hands folded on top of it, and Ethan told him everything in as straightforward a way as he could manage. And Birch listened without writing anything down, which Ethan found either impressive or slightly worrying. When Ethan finished, Birch said, "How many people know you've been collecting this material?" "We've been careful," Ethan said. "The families who gave statements, they know. The courthouse clerk must have noticed Mara pulling records, but we don't know how much he's observed or whether he's said anything to anyone." "Assume he has," Birch said. "Assume that anything conducted in a public record office has reached Granger's attention by now." He said it without alarm, just as a working premise. "What we need to establish is whether he knows what she found or only that she was looking." "How do we establish that?" "We watch what he does next," Birch said. "A man who knows he's been found out behaves differently than a man who suspects someone is looking but doesn't know how much they've seen." He picked up his satchel. "I'd like to go meet your wife now and see the documents." Mara had the kitchen table cleared and the documents laid out in the order she'd built over the past 2 months by the time they arrived. She'd made coffee and set out 3 cups, and when Birch walked in and looked at the table, he stopped in the doorway for a moment. "You organized these yourself?" he said. "Yes," Mara said. He walked to the table and stood over it, hands behind his back, and went through the chronological arrangement without touching anything, reading the labels she'd written in the corner of each grouping. He moved along the table slowly, and the kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of Fletcher's breathing from his spot near the door. After about 5 minutes, Birch pulled out a chair and sat down and picked up the first contract. He read for a long time. Occasionally he asked Mara a question and she answered it, and he asked follow-up questions and she answered those too, and Ethan sat with his coffee and understood most of what was being discussed and let it go on without inserting himself because this was her work, and she knew it better than he did. After 2 hours, Birch set the last document down and took his spectacles off and cleaned them on the hem of his coat, which seemed to be something he did when he was thinking. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "how long did this take you to compile?" "About 7 weeks," Mara said, "working most evenings and some full days when I could ride to town." Birch looked at the table again. "The survey analysis is particularly strong," he said. The boundary discrepancy on the Harmon property is unambiguous if the 1871 original is authenticated, and I believe it will be. The contract clause analysis is solid work, though a competent defense attorney will argue the language is merely unusual rather than fraudulent, and will need to counter that with mathematical demonstration of the actual financial effect. He put his spectacles back on. The Pratt statement is valuable because her husband's death creates a narrative the court will find difficult to be comfortable with, even if we can't establish causation. Can we win? Ethan said. Birch looked at him. I don't make promises about outcomes, he said. What I can tell you is that this evidence, if we handle it correctly, gives us a strong foundation for a civil fraud case and potentially a criminal referral to the territorial authority. He paused. What concerns me is the sequencing. If Granger becomes aware of the full scope of what you have before we're positioned to act on it, he has resources we don't. He can move faster on the foreclosure. He can apply pressure to your witnesses, and he has relationships with county officials that could complicate our access to public records we may still need. We may. Then we need to move before he knows how much we have, Mara said. Yes, Birch said. And we need a venue. He looked at her. You mentioned in your letter that the Frontier Fair is in September. Mara and Ethan looked at each other. It's the biggest public gathering in the county, Ethan said. 3 days. Every rancher, homesteader, and merchant from here to the territorial border. And Granger attends? He sponsors the main events, Mara said. He's announced a public address on the future of land development in the valley. He does it every 2 years, uses it as an opportunity to present himself as the county's leading citizen. Her voice was level. This year he's planning to announce several new foreclosures as examples of what he calls irresponsible frontier homesteading. I believe our names are on that list. Birch was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like the look of someone who has just seen a path through terrain they weren't sure was passable. Then that's where we do it, he said. We let him make his announcement. We let him stand in front of the entire county and declare himself the winner. And then we answer him. He looked at Mara. Publicly, with everything you've built. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's a significant risk, Ethan said. If anything goes wrong, everything about this is a significant risk, Mara said, not unkindly. The question is, which risks are in our favor? She looked at Birch. I'll need 6 more weeks to get the remaining documents certified, and I still haven't found the Reyes family. Keep looking, Birch said. The Reyes boundary case is your clearest example of outright survey fraud. It's the one where the mathematical difference between the original and the adjusted boundary is large enough to be impossible to explain as an error. If we can get Miguel Reyes on record, it changes the complexity of the case significantly. He stood up and began organizing the documents back into their sequence. In the meantime, give me 2 weeks to review everything I'm taking with me. I'll have questions. Send them to my address in Harmon County. Not by telegraph, by letter. And be careful what you put in writing. He picked up his satchel and his hat, looked at Mara directly. You've done exceptional work, he said. It was not a compliment offered to make her feel good. It was a professional assessment delivered by a man who didn't waste words on courtesies. Don't let anyone see how much of it you've done. Peut-être. It was the silence that told them. Not a warning, not a threatening visit from Pruitt, not anything overt. Just a silence that settled over the weeks following Birch's visit. A slightly too quiet quality to the town when Ethan rode in for supplies, a way people he'd known for years looked at him or slightly away from him, conversations that stopped a beat too soon when he walked into Danner's feed store. Mara noticed it first, as she noticed most things. She told Ethan about it one evening after supper, in the matter-of-fact way she'd developed for delivering information that wasn't comfortable. Someone's been talking, she said, not about the specifics. I don't think anyone knows the specifics, but Granger knows we're doing something, or suspects strongly enough that he's acting on it. Ethan thought about the courthouse clerk with the complicated expression. The records office, he said. Possibly, or one of the families I approached who decided not to give a statement. She wasn't accusatory about it. People talk. I can't blame them for it. What does he know? I think he knows I've been pulling records. I think he knows it's related to his loan portfolios. I don't think he knows about the surveys. Those are private documents, not public filings. She paused. But I think we have less time than we planned for. Less time materialized faster than either of them had wanted to believe it would. Pruitt came to the ranch on a Thursday morning in early August, and this time he didn't stay on his horse. He came to the door and knocked, which was a different kind of visit than the one that had started all of this. And when Ethan opened it, Pruitt was wearing an expression that had dropped the private smile and replaced it with something more businesslike. "Mr. Granger would like to discuss the status of your loan," Pruitt said. "He's concerned about your ability to service the coming payments and wanted to reach out proactively." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "Tell Mr. Granger I appreciate his concern. He'd like to meet in person, tomorrow, if that's convenient." "It isn't." Pruitt's jaw moved slightly. "Mr. Calloway, I think you should understand that Mr. Granger is in a position to be quite flexible if approached in a cooperative spirit. There are options available to you that might—" "Pruitt," Ethan said, "go back and tell Granger that I'll be in touch when I have something to say to him. That's all." He closed the door. Mara was standing in the middle of the kitchen. She had heard all of it. "He's feeling it," she said. He doesn't know what we have, but he's feeling something." She moved to the table and sat down. "That means he's going to accelerate." She was right. Within the week, two things happened in rapid succession. The first was that the Okafor family, who had given Mara a signed statement in July, sent a note via their eldest son saying they needed to withdraw the statement and asking Mara not to contact them further. The note didn't explain why. It didn't need to. Ethan rode out to the Okafor place 2 days later under the pretext of asking about a fence boundary and came back looking grim. "Someone from Granger's office visited them," he said. "Jacob Okafor told me nothing directly, but his wife looked scared and wouldn't meet my eyes, and there's a man I didn't recognize working their south pasture. New hired hand, supposedly, but Jacob didn't look like a man who'd just hired someone voluntarily." Mara absorbed that. 4 confirmed statements had become 3. The second thing was a notice from the county assessor's office, delivered by post, informing the Calloway Ranch that a review of their property tax assessment was being conducted and that they might expect a revised valuation within 30 days. It was signed by a deputy assessor whose name Mara had seen twice before, in documents connected to properties that had subsequently been foreclosed. She held the notice for a while after Ethan handed it to her. "He can't do that legally," she said. "Not without cause." "He has friends in that office," Ethan said. "He doesn't need cause, he needs paperwork, and he has people who'll generate paperwork." "It would raise our tax liability," Mara said, working through it. "If the revised valuation is high enough, the tax bill alone could trigger a default event under the loan terms." She set the notice down. "He doesn't need the month 13 payment anymore. He can engineer a default faster." Ethan sat down across from her. He looked tired, not the physical tired of hard work, a different kind, the kind that comes from sustained pressure without a visible end. He'd been working the ranch harder than ever since selling the North herd, trying to maintain the cattle operation on reduced stock, and the added weight of this was showing in his face in a way that the actual ranch work never had. "We could go to Birch now," he said. "File something preemptively. Make the case to the court before the fair." Mara shook her head. "If we file now, he has time to move his own legal team. He'll challenge every document, challenge the survey authentication, challenge the witness statements. The territorial court is 6 weeks out on their docket. That's 6 weeks for him to neutralize everything we have." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "At the fair, we don't give him 6 weeks. We give him 6 minutes. And if he finds out before September what we have, then we move the timeline," she said. "But I don't think he knows about the surveys, Ethan. I think that's still ours." She paused. "We need to find Miguel Reyes." The letter came from New Mexico Territory on a Tuesday, 4 weeks before the fair. It was from Miguel Reyes himself. Ethan had finally reached his contact in the South, who had known a man who knew where the Reyes family had settled, a small ranch outside a town called Cimarron, dry country, nothing like the valley they'd left. Miguel had written back in a clear, careful hand, in English that had the particular precision of someone writing in their second language with great attention to accuracy. He remembered everything. The numbers, the dates. The day Granger's man had come to show them the adjusted survey and explain, in a polite and utterly firm way, that their property boundary had always been where the new survey placed it, and that their payment schedule would need to reflect the reduced acreage, and that if they couldn't service the revised loan, they would need to consider their options. He wrote, I knew the line was wrong. My father and I had walked that boundary ourselves when we first arrived. I knew where it was, but I had no paper that could argue with their paper, and I had a wife and 3 children, and I thought perhaps I had been mistaken about what I remembered. He ended the letter by asking what Mara needed from him. She wrote back the same evening. She told him what a statement would require and what it would mean and what she believed it could accomplish. She did not minimize the risk or exaggerate the certainty. She told him the truth as clearly as she knew how to tell it, and she asked him to decide for himself. His answer came back in 11 days, which was faster than she'd expected given the distance. 4 pages. Signed. Notarized by a justice of the peace in Cimarron. Mara sat at the kitchen table and read it through twice, and the second time through something shifted in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. Relief and grief, and something harder than either of those, something with edges. She thought about Miguel Reyes writing, "I thought perhaps I had been mistaken about what I remembered," and she thought about her father's marginal notation. How? Written in a corner of a survey that knew perfectly well how, but had no proof yet to say so. She set the pages down carefully. Ethan came in from outside and looked at her face. "It came?" he said. "It came." He sat down. She handed him the pages, and he read them more slowly than she had, stopping on certain passages. When he finished, he set them on the table and looked at her. "That's everything," he said. "That's everything," she agreed. "Every piece." She looked at the folder, which was now thick enough that she'd needed to add a second tie to keep it closed. "If Birch can get these authenticated before September, we have a complete record." Ethan nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "How are you doing?" he said. Not about the case. He meant the other thing, the accumulated weight of 2 months of this work, the families who'd said yes, and the ones who'd said no, and the ones who'd withdrawn their statements out of fear, the notice from the assessor's office, the way the town had been pulling away from them with the quiet efficiency of people protecting themselves. Mara looked at him. It was a question she wasn't accustomed to being asked, and her first instinct was to deflect it, to say she was fine, to move back to the practical matter. She didn't. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm tired in a way that isn't about sleep." She looked at her hands on the table. "I keep thinking about the Okafors, about what he must have said to them or implied, to make Jacob look like that." She paused. "I keep thinking that every time someone backs away, it means he still wins a little, even if we eventually stop him." Ethan didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer reassurance that she hadn't asked for. He just nodded, the way he nodded when something was true, and he knew it was true, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Yeah," he said. That was all. But it was the right thing. She recognized that about him by now. He knew when to stop talking, which was rarer than it should have been. The trouble arrived on a Saturday in mid-August, with the particular bad timing that serious trouble tends to prefer. Ethan had ridden to Draper's Ranch in Mesa Wells to settle a final payment on the cattle sale, and Mara was alone at the ranch with Fletcher and a morning's worth of work ahead of her when she heard horses in the yard. Not one horse. 3. She went to the window and looked out and saw Pruitt and 2 men she didn't recognize, both of them broader in the shoulder than Pruitt, and with the particular quality of men who are paid to be present rather than to do any specific skilled work. She did not panic. She registered the situation, felt the cold, specific fear of it, and made a decision in the space of about 2 seconds. She went to the bedroom. She took the folder from the locked box under the bed where she'd moved it 2 weeks ago. She lifted the loose board under the wardrobe, not the one where she'd kept the surveys originally, a different one, and she put the folder in the space beneath it and set the board back and stood up and smoothed her skirt and walked to the front door and opened it before Pruitt could knock. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. Pruitt looked slightly caught off guard by the directness of it. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "is your husband home?" "He's not. We were hoping to speak with you both about a matter regarding the property. Mr. Granger's office has some concerns about certain public records requests that may have created some confusion about—" "Mr. Pruitt," Mara said, "whatever Mr. Granger wants to discuss with us, he can put it in writing and send it to our address, and we will respond through our attorney." She held his gaze without difficulty. "Is there anything else?" Pruitt's private smile was entirely absent. He looked at her the way men looked at her sometimes when she didn't behave the way they'd projected she would. Not angry yet, but recalibrating. "Your attorney," he said. "Thomas Birch, Harmon County." She gave the name without hesitation and watched Pruitt receive it and go very still for a half second in the way people go still when they hear a name they weren't expecting. He knew who Birch was. That much was clear. "Mr. Granger will be in contact," Pruitt said, after a moment that was slightly too long. "We'll look forward to it," Mara said. "Good morning." She closed the door and stood with her back against it and listened to the horses leave the yard. Fletcher pressed against her leg, which was unlike him. He usually kept a certain physical independence, and she put her hand on his head and stood there for a moment while her heartbeat settled. Then she went to the table and picked up her pen and began writing a letter to Birch. Des. What happened next came in a compressed and unpleasant sequence over the final 3 weeks before the fair. Granger filed a nuisance lawsuit against the Callaway Ranch, citing alleged encroachment on a county easement near the north fence line. The suit was without merit. Ethan had the original property deed and the easement maps clearly showed the boundary, but it required response, and responding to it cost time and the $35 that Birch charged to review and draft the initial reply. $35 they did not have easily. Clara Decker's son came to the ranch on a Tuesday evening, hat in hand and visibly uncomfortable, to say that his mother had been visited by 2 men from Granger's office and had been told, in terms she found frightening, that any statement she had given about matters relating to Granger land and livestock holdings was likely to be considered defamatory, and she might find herself the subject of legal action. "She wants to know if you can protect her," the son said. He was about 20, with Clara's same dark eyes and a look of someone who had grown up watching his mother hold things together alone and was not going to let her down if he could help it. "She hasn't taken the statement back. She wanted you to know that. Tell her she's protected by the truth of what she wrote," Mara said. "A defamation claim requires the statement to be false. Hers isn't." She paused. "Tell her we're going to be ready by September. Tell her I know it's hard and I'm asking her to hold on a little longer." The son nodded. He left. Ethan, who had been listening from the other side of the room, said, "We're running out of time." "We're running out of time," Mara agreed. She turned to the table where her work was spread out. "Birch gets the certified copies Monday. He's already contacted the Territorial Land Authority about the survey authentication. They have a deputy surveyor who can testify to the boundary discrepancy as an expert." "That's good." "It's good, but it's not enough yet." She pulled the Reyes statement out of the folder and looked at it. "We need a way to get the fair's organizers to allow us time at the public address event. Granger sponsors that segment. He controls the schedule." Ethan thought about it. "Webb Garrison runs the fair committee." "Webb Garrison owes Granger money," Mara said. "He's not going to give us platform time on that stage voluntarily." "No," Ethan said, "but he owes me a favor that has nothing to do with money." He said it slowly, as if working it out as he spoke. 4 years ago, Webb's daughter got sick in the middle of a bad winter. Roads were closed, the doctor couldn't get through from town. I knew an old woman south of the Harmon settlement who'd been a midwife and knew fever treatment. I rode 6 miles in 2 feet of snow to get her and bring her back. He paused. Webb's daughter recovered. Mara looked at him. "You've never mentioned that." "Wasn't anything to mention." "It might be something to mention now." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll ride to see him Thursday." Mara looked back into the folder, at everything that was in it. The surveys, the contracts, the statements, the letter from Miguel Reyes in his careful, precise English, the mathematical analysis she'd checked 4 times. She thought about Silas Granger standing at the fair in his good coat, announcing Ethan's foreclosure to the county as an example of irresponsible frontier homesteading, and the audience nodding with the comfortable confidence of people who believe the man at the front of the room because the man at the front of the room has always been right. She thought about what it would look like when that stopped being true. 6 more days, she said. It wasn't quite to Ethan and wasn't quite to herself, just measuring the distance. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Across the table, Ethan reached over and moved the lamp slightly to give her better light, and then went back to the harness repair he'd been doing since before supper, and Fletcher snored softly near the door, and the ranch held itself together around them in the particular stubborn way that things hold together when the people inside them refuse to let go. Silas Granger had built his plan on the assumption that Mara Whitlock would be exhausted by now, beaten down. distracted into surrender by the grinding pressure of poverty and intimidation and isolation. He had not been wrong about the exhaustion. She was exhausted. He had been wrong about what exhaustion does to certain kinds of people. For some people, it hollows them out. For Mara Whitlock, it had done something different. It had burned away everything that wasn't essential and left what remained very clear and very hard and completely disinclined to stop. 6 days, she wrote. Webb Garrison said yes. He said it on Thursday evening, standing in the doorway of his house with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had been carrying a debt for 4 years and was not sorry to have the chance to pay it. He didn't ask many questions about what Ethan wanted the time for. He said 10 minutes on the public address stage after Granger's segment, and he said he would put it in the official fare schedule under a listing that read Community Open Floor so that it wouldn't attract attention before the day itself. Ethan rode home and told Mara, and she nodded and went back to the table and kept working. The last 6 days before the fair moved, the way time moves when you are both desperate for it to pass and afraid of what comes when it does. Mara slept 4 or 5 hours a night and spent the rest in the lamplight, going through the documents one final time, checking the certified stamps that the Territorial Surveyor's Office had applied to the boundary analysis, confirming the sequencing of the statement so that the narrative they told was clear enough to follow in a public setting without needing the kind of close reading she'd given them at the kitchen table over months. Birch arrived back in Caldwell Flats on the Tuesday before the fair, and this time he came directly to the ranch. He sat with Mara for 3 hours, and they went through the presentation together. Not a speech, exactly, more of a structured disclosure. She would lay out the evidence in sequence. Birch would be present to speak to the legal standing of each piece. The statements from the families would be read aloud, with names, and those families who were willing to stand publicly would do so in the crowd. Ruth Harmon had confirmed she would be there. Clara Decker had confirmed, through her son, with a firmness that her son reported made him feel he shouldn't argue with her. Estelle Pratt had sent a short note that said only, "I will be there. Don't worry about me." The Reyes statement would be read by Birch himself, since Miguel couldn't be present. Birch had made a copy certified by the Harmon County Court and had the original secured in his office. "What about the Okafors?" Ethan asked, on the Tuesday evening when Birch was laying out the plan. "We don't name them," Birch said. "We have enough without them. And naming a family that withdrew their statement under duress without their consent would hand Granger an argument he doesn't deserve to have." He looked at Mara. "You understand that, I think." "I decided that 2 weeks ago," Mara said. "I wasn't going to use them." Birch nodded. He looked at the folder one more time, the full assembled record, organized and indexed and cross-referenced in Mara's handwriting. And then he closed it and leaned back. "There will be a moment," he said, "when the crowd isn't sure what's happening, when it shifts from Granger's announcement to what we're doing. That moment is going to feel uncomfortable. People are going to look at you and look at him and try to figure out which one to believe." "I know," Mara said. "How you hold yourself in that moment matters. Not just what you say, how you look when you say it." He wasn't trying to make her nervous. He was being precise. "You have the evidence. The evidence is sound, but public persuasion has a physical component, and a man like Granger has spent decades learning how to own a room." He paused. "You have to own it too." Mara looked at him. "I've been talked over, dismissed, and laughed at in public for most of my adult life," she said. "I know what it feels like to stand somewhere while people decide whether to hear you. It doesn't frighten me the way it might." Birch looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his hat. "Good," he said. "That's the right answer." The Caldwell Flats Frontier Fair opened on the first Thursday of September under a sky that had gone from the white heat of August to something cleaner and higher, the particular blue of early fall that made distances look closer than they were. The fairgrounds occupied the flatland east of town, and by mid-morning the grounds were crowded enough that sound moved differently. Voices and livestock, and the mechanical clatter from the demonstration tents folding together into the specific noise of a large gathering that had not yet settled on its own mood. Ethan and Mara arrived together in the wagon, which Ethan had cleaned and whose wheels he'd re-greased the night before. Mara wore a dark gray dress she'd made herself over the summer, practical in cut, with a collar she'd added that gave it a formality the original pattern hadn't included. She had her hair in its usual knot and the 2 small combs at the sides that she'd worn on the wedding day. Ethan wore his best coat, which had been brushed again. Fletcher had been left at the ranch. This was not a day for a dog. They found Birch near the entrance to the main grounds, and he fell into step with them without ceremony. The three of them moved through the fairgrounds, and Ethan nodded to people he knew, and some of them nodded back, and some of them looked elsewhere. And Mara kept her eyes forward and her expression composed. She was afraid. She had been afraid since waking before dawn and lying in the gray half-light of the bedroom thinking about everything that could go wrong. She had not said this to Ethan, but when they'd left the house that morning, he'd taken her hand briefly before she climbed up to the wagon seat, just for a moment, and she had thought, he knows. The public address stage was a raised wooden platform at the north end of the fairgrounds, with benches arranged in a semicircle in front of it and standing room behind. By early afternoon, when the schedule called for the civic segment, there would be several hundred people in that area. Every significant landowner in the county. Every merchant, every rancher, every family that had made the trip in from the outlying homesteads for the fair's 3-day run. The Caldwell Flats Courier always sent a reporter to the public address events. Mara had confirmed this with the editor 3 weeks ago under the pretext of a general inquiry. She had also, in the past 2 weeks, written letters to 2 other journalists, one in Harmon County and one at a territorial paper based further south, describing in careful general terms a matter of significant public interest that would be disclosed at the Caldwell Flats Frontier Fair on Thursday and suggesting they might find it worth their attention. She had not been certain either of them would come. The Harmon County journalist was already there. She'd spotted him near the livestock pens when they arrived, a young man with a notebook who didn't look like a rancher. She didn't point him out to anyone. Silas Granger arrived at the fairgrounds at noon with 2 members of his staff and the comfortable, unhurried manner of a man who goes places knowing they will wait for him. He moved through the grounds the way he moved through everything, acknowledging people with the precisely calibrated attention of a man who understood that social power was maintained in increments. A nod here, a firm handshake there, a word to this man's wife, and a remembrance of that man's son's name. He had heard about the attorney. Pruitt had told him about Birch within a day of the ranch visit, and he had made his own inquiries and knew Birch's work well enough to know he was serious. He had also learned, through a contact in the county records office, that Mara Calloway had spent several weeks pulling land registry filings and loan documents from the public record. He understood the general shape of what she was attempting. He had not been idle. In the 3 weeks since Pruitt's visit to the ranch, Granger had had his Tucson legal team review his loan portfolio and identify any vulnerabilities in the documentation. They had found several. He had spent a considerable amount of money having those vulnerabilities quietly corrected, not in the original documents, which couldn't be changed, but in supplementary agreements and revised schedules that his borrowers had signed at various points over the years, sometimes without fully understanding what they were signing. Those supplementary documents, his attorneys assured him, would complicate any attempt to characterize the original contracts as fraudulent. He had also spoken to 2 county officials about the nature of the land survey records and what procedures existed for challenging the authentication of historical documents. He believed he was ahead of them. He was not entirely wrong about being ahead of them. He was wrong about how far. At 2 o'clock, the public address segment began. A member of the fair committee, not Webb Garrison, who had positioned himself somewhere in the back of the standing crowd, introduced the segment and yielded the stage to Silas Granger. Granger came up the steps and stood behind the podium that the fair committee had provided, and the crowd settled into the attentive, deferential quiet that he was accustomed to producing. He was good at this. He had the natural authority of a large man who was comfortable in front of people, and he used it well. Measured pace, clear voice, the occasional pause that let a point sink in. He spoke about the county's growth over the past decade. He spoke about the importance of responsible land stewardship and the challenges of frontier development. He spoke about Granger Land and Livestock Holdings' role in stabilizing the valley economy and providing financial mechanisms that had allowed families to stay on their land when times were difficult. Then he said, "It is with some regret that I must also report on a number of properties that have, despite our best efforts and considerable flexibility on our part, failed to remain viable operations." He listed 4 names. The Calloway Ranch was third. The Calloway property on the north side of Birch Creek represents an unfortunate example of, "Mr. Granger," the voice came from the crowd. Clear, unhurried, carrying without being raised. Every head in the semicircle turned. Mara Calloway was standing about 15 feet from the front of the stage, in the open space between the benches and the platform. She hadn't moved forward dramatically. She'd simply spoken, and the crowd had found her. Granger looked at her. His expression did not change. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I'll be happy to discuss the particulars of your situation after—" "I'd like to discuss them now," she said, "in front of these people, if you'll allow it." The crowd made a sound, not quite murmuring, not quite silence. That uncertain in-between noise of several hundred people recalibrating at once. Granger looked at her for a moment. She could see him calculating. If he refused to yield the stage, he looked like a man hiding something. If he allowed it, he was giving ground he hadn't planned to give. He spread his hands in a gesture of gracious accommodation that cost him nothing visibly. "By all means," he said. He stepped back from the podium, but he did not step off the stage. Mara walked to the steps and came up them and stood at the podium. She set her folder on the surface in front of her. She did not open it yet. She looked out at the crowd. Several hundred faces, some curious, some already dismissive, some she recognized and some she didn't. She saw Ruth Harmon near the left side of the benches, sitting with her hands in her lap and her back straight. She saw Clara Decker's son at the back of the standing crowd. She saw the young journalist from Harmon County with his notebook open. She saw Ethan standing to the right of the stage, near the steps, watching her with an expression she recognized. Not anxious, not performing reassurance, just present. She looked back at the crowd. "My name is Mara Calloway," she said. "Some of you know me. Some of you know me as Mara Whitlock. I grew up in this county. My father worked the county land registry office for 20 years. She paused. "Over the past 3 months, I have been reviewing land and financial records relating to property transactions in this valley going back approximately 12 years. I want to share what I found." She opened the folder. The loan contract held by Granger Land and Livestock Holdings against the Calloway Ranch contains a compounding interest mechanism that is not disclosed in plain language in the main body of the agreement. The effect of this mechanism is to increase the outstanding balance at the first payment date, month 13 under the restructured terms, by approximately 66% above the stated principal. She looked up. This was not an error in the drafting. It is present in varying forms in 9 of the 11 operating loan contracts I reviewed from public court filings. The crowd was very quiet now. "I would like to read you some of those names." She read them. 8 names, because the Okafor family she did not read. 8 names of ranchers and homesteaders who had lost land, lost operations, lost years of work in what they had believed was their own failure to manage what life had given them. When she finished reading the names, she heard a sound from somewhere in the crowd. A man's voice saying something low that she couldn't catch. And then another voice, a woman's, saying, "That's the Villanueva place. I remember when—" Granger stepped forward from the back of the stage. "These are serious allegations," he said, and his voice was controlled and measured, with just the right degree of concerned authority. "I would ask this audience to consider that reviewing public filings without the legal expertise to properly interpret them—" "Mr. Birch," Mara said. Thomas Birch came up the stage steps from the other side and stood beside her. He had the certified folder under his arm, and he held it up briefly without drama before setting it on the podium beside Mara's. "Thomas Birch," he said to the crowd, "I am an attorney licensed to practice in this territory. I have reviewed the documents Mrs. Calloway is referencing, along with original land survey records from the county registry, and I can speak to their legal standing." He looked at Granger. "The contract analysis Mrs. Calloway has presented is accurate." Something moved through the crowd. Not noise exactly, more like a pressure shift. Granger's voice came measured and firm. "Mr. Birch's opinion is one attorney's reading of complex financial instruments. I have a legal team in Tucson that would disagree significantly with—" "The survey records are not a matter of legal interpretation," Mara said. She pulled the certified survey comparison from the folder. "This is the original 1871 land survey for the Reyes property, adjacent to the Eastern Valley. This is the survey commissioned in 1883, which was used as the basis for the boundary adjustment that reduced the Reyes property by 280 acres. She held them up, side by side. These discrepancies were certified this month by a deputy surveyor from the Territorial Land Authority. The boundary line does not move because of natural variation or survey error. It moves in one direction, consistently, and the land it removes from the Reyes property appears in the following year's holdings of Granger land and livestock. She set the surveys down. Miguel Reyes and his family left this county in 1888 believing they had failed, she said. They had not failed. They had been defrauded. The crowd was not quiet now. It was making the dense, overlapping sound of many people talking at once. And in that sound there were questions, and there was anger, and there was the particular quality of a large group of people rapidly reassessing something they had believed for a long time. Granger stepped to the front of the stage. His composure was holding, but it had taken on a different character, tighter, more deliberate. "I will not stand here and allow—" "Ruth Harmon," Mara said clearly. Ruth Harmon stood up from the bench where she'd been sitting. She was a small woman with gray at her temples and the bearing of someone who had made a decision and was not going to revisit it. "Our loan was restructured in 1885, Ruth said, in a voice that carried surprisingly well for its size. "We were told our new payment schedule reflected administrative adjustments. We trusted that. 3 years later, we missed a payment by $40 because our east well went dry and we'd had to buy water. Granger's office gave us 60 days to make it good. We did. A year after that, there was another shortfall. This time they renegotiated and took the North Quarter as collateral." She paused. "We lost the North Quarter to foreclosure 2 years later. I would like to know today whether that shortfall was built into our contract before we ever signed it." "It was," Birch said. He said it clearly, to the crowd. Based on the mathematical analysis of the contract terms, the Harmon family was in a position where meeting every payment on the original schedule was mathematically impossible after month 22. Ruth sat down. Her hands were shaking slightly and she pressed them together in her lap, and the woman sitting beside her was a woman Mara didn't know, put a hand on her arm. Estelle Pratt stood up from somewhere further back in the standing crowd, and Mara hadn't seen her come in and felt something shift in her chest when she saw her. Estelle was in her 60s, white-haired, with the straight-backed quality of someone who had survived considerable things by refusing to bend completely. "My husband, Franklin Pratt, managed this family for 30 years, Estelle said. "He was a careful man. He kept records. He checked figures twice." Her voice was steady. "When we fell behind on our loan in 1887, Silas Granger's man told us it was because Franklin had made errors in our household accounting." She looked directly at Granger on the stage. "Franklin blamed himself until the day he died. I am here today to say in front of this county that my husband did not make errors. The errors were made for him and put in the contract before he ever picked up a pen. The sound in the crowd was different now. It had a texture to it, the sound of recognition, of many people simultaneously placing something that had not previously had a name. Granger spoke. His voice was still controlled, but there was something beneath it now that hadn't been there before, a heat that was trying to pass itself off as righteous indignation. "These women are making claims they cannot substantiate. They are being manipulated by an opportunistic attorney and a woman who has personal grievances against my organization. I have built this county's economy for 20 years and I will not—" "Mr. Granger!" The voice came from the back of the crowd, and several people turned. A man was making his way through from the standing area to the front. He was heavy-set and middle-aged, with a sun-dark face and calloused hands, and Mara did not recognize him immediately. Then she did. James Okafor. Not Jacob. Jacob's older brother, who had moved to the Harmon settlement 3 years ago, who was not connected to Granger's holdings, who had no reason to be afraid. "I watched my brother lose half his courage over what this man did to his family," James Okafor said. He had stopped at the edge of the benches, close enough that most of the crowd could see his face. "Jacob signed away his land rights in 1889 because he was told he had no choice. He was told it in ways that weren't direct enough to argue with. He's been sharecropping on land his father built a life on because he believed he owed the debt." He looked at the stage. "If what this woman is saying is true, my brother never owed what they told him he owed." He looked at Mara. She looked back at him. She did not know what to do with what she was feeling, so she did what she always did when she didn't know what to do with something. She kept going. "I have here," she said, "a notarized statement from Miguel Reyes, currently residing in New Mexico territory, regarding the boundary adjustment that reduced his family's property by 280 acres in 1883. She looked at Birch. Birch took the statement from the certified folder and read it aloud. He read it in full, in his clipped professional voice, and the fairgrounds were quiet enough that the words carried to the edges of the crowd. Miguel's careful English, his description of walking the boundary with his father, his account of the day Granger's man arrived with the new survey. The sentence, "I thought perhaps I had been mistaken about what I remembered." When Birch finished reading, the silence lasted for several seconds. Then it broke, and not in the way silence is usually broke at public gatherings. It didn't dissolve into general noise. It broke into specific directed sound. People turning to each other, people calling out questions. A man near the front of the benches saying, "What are the names on those contracts? Can we see the names?" And another voice from further back saying, "The Decker place. This is about the Decker place too, isn't it?" And someone else saying, "I knew there was something wrong with that survey. I said so in '86, nobody would." Granger came to the front of the stage, and he did what powerful men do when their power is challenged publicly, and they have not yet found another move. He got louder. "This is slander," he said, and his voice had lost its careful calibration, was running slightly too fast. "This is a coordinated attack on a legitimate business by people who failed to manage their own affairs and are looking for someone else to blame. I have 30 years of documented Mr. Granger." The voice was new. Everyone looked. A man in the front row of benches had stood up. He was one of the county's larger independent ranchers, a man named Tate, who had always kept cordial relations with Granger because it was practical to do so in this county. He was not poor. He was not in debt to Granger. He had no stake in this. "I'd like to see those contracts," Tate said. Not loudly, calmly. The calm of a man who has decided something. "The ones she's described. I'd like to see the mathematical analysis." He looked at Mara, not Granger. "Is that something that can be arranged?" "Yes," Mara said. "Copies can be made available through Mr. Birch's office in Harmon County. I can also provide the original certified documents to any county official who requests them for review." "I'll request them," said a voice near the back. Mara looked. A man she barely recognized. She knew the face, but not the name. And then she placed him, one of the county commissioners, not one she knew to be in Granger's pocket. A quiet man, largely ceremonial in function, not quiet now. Granger pointed at him from the stage. "Walter, I want you to think very carefully about—" "Don't," said Walter. He said it without particular drama, in the flat tone of a man who has just crossed a line he didn't know he was going to cross until he found himself on the other side of it. "Don't tell me to think carefully, Silas. Not right now." Granger stood on the stage and looked out at the crowd, and the crowd looked back at him. And Mara watched him in that moment with a steadiness she would not have expected from herself. She had imagined this moment for months, and she had imagined it would feel triumphant or frightening or both. But what she actually felt was something quieter. Something that was more like recognition than victory. Like seeing the true shape of something you've been looking at from the wrong angle for a long time. He turned to look at her, just for a moment. She met his eyes without looking away. He stepped back from the front of the stage, and that step, small, involuntary, barely visible, was the moment. Not the shouting, not the crowd noise, not anything she had said or Birch had said or the statements had said. That half step backward. Everyone in the front rows saw it. The Harmon County journalist was writing very fast. The Caldwell Flats Courier reporter, a man named Giles, who had been covering the fair for 8 years and had never written anything that gave anyone a sleepless night, was standing near the stage steps with an expression Ethan later described as a man who has spent his career watching interesting things not happen and has suddenly been confronted with the reverse problem. Birch came down from the stage and stood beside Ethan. "The commissioner's request for documents triggers a formal review process," he said quietly. "Once that review is opened, Granger can't dispose of records without creating criminal exposure. We need to file the civil complaint in the territorial court by Monday." "Can we do it by Monday?" "I've had the complaint drafted for 10 days, Birch said. "I was waiting for today." Ethan looked at him. "You were fairly confident about this." "I was confident about the evidence," Birch said. "The public component is always uncertain, but your wife—" He paused, chose the words with the care he applied to everything. She understood something about how truth works in public that I've seen practicing attorneys fail to learn. Ethan looked toward the stage where Mara was still standing, because Tate and two other ranchers had come forward and were asking to see the specific document she'd referenced, and she was going through the folder with them with the same composed attention she brought to the kitchen table. She looked tired. She had looked tired for weeks, but she also looked, Ethan thought, like herself, like the actual shape of herself, not the compressed and cautious version she'd been carrying around for most of the time he'd known her. He made his way through the crowd to the stage steps and waited there. And after a while she came down, and he handed her the water he'd been carrying since mid-morning, and she took it and drank most of it without stopping. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "He's going to fight it," she said. "The civil suit. He has resources. It's going to take time." "I know." "The ranch, one thing at a time," he said. "Today was today. Let it be today for a minute." She looked at him, and something in her face shifted. The sustained control of the past several hours easing just slightly, just enough to show the actual weight of it underneath. "Okay," she said, "just that." Behind them, the fairgrounds noise had changed character entirely. The comfortable fair day sound of it was gone, replaced by something more urgent and more alive. People were still talking. They were going to be talking for a long time. The Harmon County journalist closed his notebook and reached for a second one. Silas Granger had left the stage. No one had watched him go. The civil complaint landed in the territorial court on Monday morning, as Birch had promised. By Wednesday, a copy of it had made the front page of the Harmon County Gazette under a headline that occupied the full width of the paper, and the Caldwell Flats Courier, Giles having apparently located in himself a previously dormant capacity for consequential journalism, ran a 4-column account of the fair's public address segment that named names, cited figures, and included a direct quotation from Estelle Pratt that the editor placed in a box at the center of the page. The territorial paper that Mara had written to in August sent its own correspondent the following week, and that piece went to readers across 4 counties. Silas Granger's Tucson legal team filed a response to the civil complaint within 10 days, as expected. It was 43 pages, and it challenged every element of the case on procedural grounds: the authentication of the surveys, the standing of Birch to represent multiple plaintiffs in a consolidated action, the admissibility of statements taken without formal legal process. It was competent work, and Birch said so when he sent Mara a copy with his annotations in the margins. "They're not wrong about some of this," he wrote in his clipped handwriting. "We will have to re-authenticate the Reyes boundary survey through the territorial land office rather than the county level. That costs time and a fee. I am handling the fee. I need you to write to Miguel Reyes again and request his consent to a formal deposition, which can be conducted by a justice of the peace in New Mexico and transmitted to the court here. The process is established. It will add 6 to 8 weeks to the timeline." "Masam de Antrauskin," Mara wrote to Miguel Reyes that evening. He replied in 9 days. "Yes," he wrote, at the top of the page before any greeting or explanation. Just yes, and then everything else. Chat. The weeks after the fair were not easy weeks. Mara had expected some version of relief, the sustained pressure of the past months releasing once the public disclosure was made, the way a held breath releases when you finally let it go. What she found instead was a different kind of pressure. The legal process had its own rhythm, and it was slow and impersonal and occasionally maddening, and it required a different kind of sustained attention than the investigative work had. Less discovery, more waiting, less momentum, more correspondence. Granger's people were not idle in the interim. The nuisance lawsuit about the fence line easement dragged on through October, costing small amounts of money and larger amounts of time. Pruitt no longer came to the ranch himself, which Mara took as a sign that Granger was being more careful about anything that could be characterized as intimidation, but there were other pressures. The property tax reassessment was still technically pending, and while the county commissioner's formal records request had put the investigation into official territory and complicated Granger's ability to move aggressively, it had not resolved anything. The ranch operated on the edge of what was viable. Ethan had taken on fence work for 2 neighboring operations to bring in additional income, and Mara had resumed bookkeeping for several businesses in town. 3 of them, this time, in a way that suggested the fair had shifted something in the town's calculation of what kind of woman she was. Or perhaps in their willingness to act on what they'd always known, but found convenient to ignore. She didn't examine it too carefully. People were complicated, and she'd spent enough of her life being angry about their complications that she'd gotten tired of it. She took the work because the work was there, and they needed the money. One morning in late October, she was going through accounts at the kitchen table when Ethan came in from outside and set a letter on the table beside her coffee cup without interrupting her. She finished the column she was on and picked it up. It was from the territorial court. A date for the first formal hearing had been set, the third week of January. She set it down and looked at it. 4 months, Ethan said. He was leaning against the doorframe. Better than 6, she said. Birch said it could be 6. How are you feeling about it? She thought about the honest answer. Anxious, she said. I know the evidence is solid. I know what we built, but the actual courtroom is different from the kitchen table, and Granger has attorneys who do this every day, and we have one man working this case alongside other work. She paused. And it depends on the judge. Birch knows who the judge is? Honorable Leonard Marsh, Mara said. Appointed 8 years ago. Birch says he's methodical, takes his time. Doesn't favor either side of the money divide particularly. She looked at the letter again, which is about all we can ask for. Ethan came to the table and poured himself coffee. He sat down across from her and looked at the letter and then at her. Whatever happens, he said, I want you to know something. She waited. Whatever happens in January, he said, whatever the court does or doesn't do, what you did, finding it, building it, standing up there at that fair, that's already done. He can't undo that. He wasn't looking away from her, which he sometimes did when he was saying something that cost him something. People know now. The ones who were hiding it from themselves and the ones who genuinely didn't know. That's real, regardless of what Marsh decides. Mara looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying something about how the legal outcome still mattered enormously, about the ranch and the fraudulent loans and the families who needed formal restitution, and all of that was true, and she didn't say it because she understood what he was actually saying, which was something different from and larger than the legal outcome. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in a way that didn't require elaboration. He nodded, drank his coffee, went back outside. Fletcher lifted his head from the floor and looked at her and then put it back down. She went back to the accounts. The hearing in January lasted 4 days. It was held in the territorial courthouse in a town called Millhaven, 40 miles from Caldwell Flats, in a building that was newer than the town deserved and had the institutional smell of fresh wood and old paper. Judge Marsh was a spare man of about 60, with a high forehead and the habit of writing notes with a very small, precise hand while witnesses spoke, which Mara found reassuring in the way that evidence of careful attention was always reassuring. Granger attended every day with his Tucson attorneys, 2 of them, and they were good. They were genuinely good, and watching them work. The procedural objections, the witness examination techniques, the precise way they framed every counterargument to create maximum uncertainty around minimum facts. Mara felt a cold respect for the craft of it, alongside the cold fear of it. Birch was good too. He was not showy. He did not perform. He laid things out in order, connected them with clear language, and let the evidence carry what the evidence was strong enough to carry. He knew which fights to have and which ones to decline. And that discipline, Mara thought, was its own kind of expertise. She testified on the second day. She had thought she was prepared. She had gone through her testimony with Birch a dozen times in the months leading up to the hearing. She knew the documents completely. She knew the sequence, the figures, the discrepancies, the mathematical analysis, every element of what she'd built. What she had not fully prepared for was the particular quality of Granger's senior attorney, a man named Aldous, who had silver hair and the unhurried patience of someone who has cross-examined many people and knows that patience itself is a form of pressure, asking her questions designed not to find factual errors, but to make her seem like someone with a grievance rather than an investigator. Mrs. Calloway, Aldous said in his measured voice, isn't it true that you began this review of records shortly after your marriage to Mr. Calloway, when you became aware that his ranch was in financial difficulty? Yes, she said. And would you describe yourself as someone with prior legal training or formal financial education? No. So this analysis that you're presenting, the contract language interpretation, the mathematical projections, this is the work of someone with no formal qualification in either law or finance. Birch started to rise, and Mara said calmly, The mathematics is the mathematics, Mr. Aldous. You're welcome to check it. Aldous paused. A slight pause, the kind a skilled cross-examiner makes when something small goes differently than planned. The question, he said, is whether your interpretation of the contract language is... The effect of the contract language is documented in the mathematical outcome, Mara said. A borrower who makes every payment on schedule still arrives at month 13 with a balance 66% higher than stated at signing. That's not my interpretation. That's what happens when you follow the numbers. She held his gaze. If your client's legal team believes the math is wrong, I would welcome a point-by-point review. Aldous moved on. After the session, in the small room where they kept their materials, Birch took off his spectacles and cleaned them and said, "Don't do that again." "Do what?" "Invite them to challenge the math in open court." He looked at her. "Even when you're right to be confident, you don't issue invitations. It sounds defensive." Mara thought about it. "You're right," she said. "I won't." She didn't. For the rest of her testimony, she answered what was asked precisely and nothing more, and she let the documents speak the volume that documents were better equipped to speak than she was. On the fourth day, Miguel Reyes's deposition was read into the court record by the clerk, and Birch presented the certified reauthentication of the 1871 and 1883 surveys from the Territorial Land Office's deputy surveyor, who had traveled to Millhaven to give his own testimony. The deputy surveyor was a dry, technical man with no stake in the case and no interest in drama, and he explained in careful language exactly what the boundary discrepancy represented and why it could not be attributed to survey error. And Judge Marsh wrote in his small, precise hand for a long time while he spoke. Granger's attorneys cross-examined the surveyor for over an hour. They found no significant errors in his methodology. They challenged his interpretation of two minor technical points, and he conceded one of them and held firm on the other with the calm stubbornness of someone who knows exactly how much certainty their expertise entitles them to. And that quality, that specific willingness to concede what was genuinely uncertain rather than defend everything, landed in the courtroom in a way that Mara recognized. It was the same quality that had made her own analysis credible. Truth that admits its limits is more convincing than truth that claims none. Judge Marsh adjourned on the fourth afternoon and said he would issue his ruling within 60 days. They drove back to Caldwell Flats in the January cold, Ethan and Mara and Birch, who had arranged passage in their wagon as far as the Harmon County cutoff. The road was long and the sky was the gray-white of winter overcast, and nobody said much for the first hour. Then Birch said, "I think we made the case." Ethan glanced at him. "You think?" "I never say more than think," Birch said. "But yes, I think we made it." Mara sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the road ahead, and allowed herself, carefully, the small tentative thing that she had been refusing to call hope for the past 5 months because hope was expensive, and she had learned a long time ago to be careful with expensive things. She allowed it for about 30 seconds. Then she pulled her coat tighter against the cold and looked at Birch. "What happens if Marsh finds in our favor?" she said. "Specifically, walk me through it." And Birch, who understood that some people process hope best by turning it into procedure, walked her through it for the next 40 miles. Judge Marsh's ruling came in 53 days. It was 41 pages. Mara read all of it, which took most of a morning, and then she read the summary section again, and then she set it down on the kitchen table and sat with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the window. Ethan came in from outside and looked at her. "Well," he said. "He found fraud," she said, "on the contract structures. Across all 9 documented cases, he found the compounding mechanism constituted material misrepresentation." She looked up. "He voided the Callaway loan in its entirety. No balance, no payments. The ranch is clear." Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway and said nothing for a moment. He looked at the table, at the folder that had been living on or near that table for 6 months, at his wife's hands flat on the surface. "And the others?" he said. "Restitution proceedings for all 9 affected parties," Mara said. The Reyes boundary fraud, he referred to the Territorial Criminal Authority. He used language in the finding that Birch told me specifically to look for. He described the boundary adjustment as deliberate falsification of public records for financial gain, and that phrase is what triggers criminal jurisdiction. She stopped, picked up the ruling again. read one sentence from the summary section aloud, not because Ethan needed to hear it, but because she needed to hear herself say it. The evidence presented demonstrates a systematic and sustained pattern of predatory financial practice that, over the course of 12 years, deprived numerous families of land, equity, and economic stability through mechanisms deliberately obscured from their comprehension at the time of agreement. She set it down. "He saw it," she said, simply. Ethan crossed the room and sat down at the table, not across from her, beside her, which he didn't usually do. He looked at the ruling and then he looked at her. "Your father's work," he said. She looked at him. "The surveys," he said. He kept them. He annotated them. He started the question you finished. He paused. "I think about that sometimes." Mara looked at the window, at the winter light coming through it, pale and clean. "I think about it too," she said. They sat with that for a while, the way you sit with something that is too large and too complicated and too real to package into a tidy feeling. The criminal proceedings against Silas Granger moved through the territorial court over the following 8 months, and they were neither quick nor clean nor satisfying in the uncomplicated way that justice is satisfying in stories where justice is the point. Granger fought it. Of course he fought it. His Tucson attorneys filed every available challenge, pursued every procedural delay, attacked the chain of custody on the survey documents, and the standing of Miguel Reyes's deposition, and the methodology of the territorial surveyor's analysis. They were expensive and they were skilled, and they slowed everything down to the particular grinding pace of a legal system being worked by people who understood its mechanics better than most. But the evidence was what it was. Mara had built it to be what it was, and what it was thorough. Granger was convicted in September of the following year on 4 counts of fraud and 1 count of falsification of public land records. His holdings, the 6,000 owned acres and the mortgages on another 12,000, were placed in receivership pending a restitution process administered by a court-appointed official out of the territorial capital. He did not go to prison immediately. His attorneys secured an appeal on the falsification count, which extended the proceedings for another 7 months. He was ultimately sentenced to 4 years at the territorial facility in Millhaven on the fraud convictions, with the falsification count resulting in a concurrent sentence. The appeal on that count was denied in the end because the evidence was what it was. Mara heard the final sentencing from Birch, by letter, on a Tuesday morning in April. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and then she folded it and set it aside and finished her coffee. When Ethan came in, she told him. He sat down and looked at the table. 4 years, he said. "Yes." "Is that—" He stopped, looked for the right word. "Is that enough?" It was an honest question, and she appreciated that he was asking it honestly, rather than performing the satisfaction he was supposed to feel. "I don't know," she said. "The Reyes family gets their land compensated. The restitution process will take years, and nobody is going to get back exactly what they lost, because time doesn't work that way." She turned her coffee cup. "The families who said no out of fear, nothing gives them back the years of believing they failed." She thought about the Okafors, about Carlos Villanueva at his gate. What Granger gets is 4 years. What he did took 12. "That's not justice," Ethan said. "It's what justice actually looks like," Mara said. "It's not clean and it's not proportional and it doesn't give people back what was taken from them. It just stops the thing from continuing and makes a record of what happened so that the next person who tries it has something standing in their way." She looked at him. "I used to think justice was supposed to feel like the wrong being undone. It doesn't feel like that. It feels more like a door closing. Not the same door that was broken, a different one." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is that enough for you?" Mara thought about her father's handwriting in the margins of a survey. The word "how" in the corner. 3 years of that question sitting under a floorboard, waiting for someone who could hear it. "It'll have to be," she said, and she didn't mean it defeatedly. She meant it the way you mean something when you have looked at the actual size of a thing and decided to accept its actual size rather than the size you wished it were. The restitution process, imperfect and slow as it was, produced some results that were real. The Harmon family received a financial settlement that allowed them to retire the remainder of their operating debt and put a modest amount aside. Ruth Harmon, when Mara saw her at the county courthouse during one of the many procedural hearings that populated the following year, hugged her with the particular directness of someone who does not hug people easily or often. "Henry said to tell you thank you," Ruth said. "He's not going to say it himself because you know how he is." "I know how he is," Mara said. "Tell him it took all of us." Estelle Pratt received a formal notation in the court record that her late husband's loan had been fraudulently constructed, and she asked Birch to have a certified copy framed, which he arranged, and she hung it in her front room because, she told Mara, she wanted it where she could see it every morning. "Franklin can't see it," she said, "but I can, and I can say, you were right, and you didn't fail, and I'm sorry I didn't know sooner." The Callaway Ranch, freed from the Granger loan, still needed work. Freedom from a fraudulent debt did not conjure water into a dry creek or replace the north herd that had been sold to fund the attorney's retainer. Ethan replanted the south pasture with a drought-tolerant grass variety he'd read about in an agricultural circular, and by the following summer it had taken hold in a way that wasn't dramatic but was real, a slow, incremental green returning to land that had been dusty for 2 years. He drilled a third well in the spring in a location the neighbor's son had suggested after observing the topography, and it hit water at 60 feet and has not run dry since. These were not triumphs. They were things that worked after a long time of things not working, and Mara had learned enough by then to understand the difference between a triumph and a thing that simply, stubbornly works. A triumph is clean and self-contained. A thing that works is ongoing. It requires continuing attention. It can fail again. She preferred the things that worked in the end. They were more honest. In the 2 years following the fair, Mara found herself doing something she had not planned for. It started with Ruth Harmon asking her to look at a loan contract that a cousin of Henry's had been offered by a land company out of the territorial capital. A different company, no connection to Granger, but with certain structural similarities in the repayment language that Ruth wanted someone to look at before her cousin signed. Mara looked at it, found what was there to find, wrote a clear analysis that Ruth's cousin could take to a straightforward local attorney and use as a starting point. The cousin didn't lose her land. Word traveled the way word travels in frontier counties, which is to say quickly and with embellishments that Mara was not always comfortable with but could not entirely prevent. Other people came. Not many at first. A family from the northern settlement with a lease agreement they didn't understand, a widow who'd received a revised tax assessment that seemed wrong, a young man whose father had recently died and left behind a tangle of financial agreements with a livestock company that the young man couldn't parse. She helped them. She had the time and the skill and the inclination, and she was honest with herself about the fact that this work satisfied something in her that the ranch work, though she did it faithfully, did not. Numbers had always been a language to her, and helping people understand documents that had been written specifically to be misunderstood felt like translation in the most direct sense, taking something designed to confuse and making it legible. She didn't set up an office or put a sign on the door. She worked at the kitchen table because the kitchen table was where the work had always happened, and people came to the ranch on arranged days and she gave them what she could. Birch wrote to her in the spring of the second year and said he had a colleague in the territorial capital who was building a legal aid practice and was looking for someone with demonstrated expertise in financial document analysis. Would she be interested in consulting? The work would be correspondence-based, the pay modest, the cases occasionally significant. She wrote back the same day. Yes? She was not a lawyer. She would never be a lawyer. The route to that was longer and more expensive than her circumstances allowed, and she had made her peace with that. But what she was, she had learned, was specific and useful in ways that didn't require a credential to be real. She could read a document and see what it actually did. She could explain what she saw in language that people without legal training could understand. She could build a record that held up. That was something. That was, it turned out, quite a lot. On an evening in late October, 2 years after the wedding that had been designed to end both of them, Mara and Ethan sat on the porch of the ranch house in the particular quiet of a fall sunset that had no performance in it. Just the sky going gold and then deeper, and the cattle sounds from the south pasture where the grass had come back, and Fletcher asleep against the porch step in the way he slept when he had decided the day was done. Ethan said, "Do you think about how it might have gone differently if you hadn't found what you found?" Mara thought about it. She thought about the ranch sold to settle the fraudulent debt, about her father's surveys sitting under a floorboard in a house that was no longer hers, eventually found by someone who didn't know what they were looking at, or not found at all. She thought about the families who'd already lost and the families who would have followed. Yes, she said, sometimes. And I think the difference was not intelligence or courage or any particular quality that I can take credit for having. She looked at the sky. I think the difference was that I had time. He put me somewhere that he thought would take all my time. A failing ranch, a bad marriage, survival on the edge. And instead I had a partner who meant what he said when he said it. She paused. That gave me the space to do the work. Without that, I don't know that I find it. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a generous reading of my contribution. It's an accurate one, she said. He looked at her sideways. You know what I think about sometimes? What? That church full of people who came to watch us fail. He leaned back in the chair, looking at the sky. I wonder how many of them went home that day and thought about it afterward, whether they felt... He didn't finish the sentence. Some of them probably, Mara said, and some of them went home and had supper and forgot about it by morning. She considered. People are like that. The same people who'll laugh at something cruel on a Tuesday will stand up for something decent on a Wednesday if you give them a reason to. She thought about Tate standing up at the fair, asking to see the contracts. About the commissioner saying, "Don't" to Granger in the flat voice of a man who surprised himself. They're not heroes. They're just people. Sometimes people do the right thing when the moment is specific enough. Is that enough? Ethan said. It was an echo of the question he'd asked about the sentencing, and she recognized that. It's what there is, she said, and it turned out to be enough for this. Maybe not enough for everything, but enough for this. The sky went deeper. The cattle had gone quiet. Fletcher's ear twitched at something. A night insect, a breath of wind, and then went still again. Mara looked at the south pasture, where the grass moved in the evening air in the slow, unhurried way of things that have taken hold. She thought about what she had believed 2 years ago, before the wedding, before Pruitt at the gate, before any of this. That belonging to a place was something granted to you by the people already in it. That worth was a verdict rendered by others, and you could only hope for a favorable ruling. She had lived inside that belief for a long time without examining it, the way you live inside the shape of a small room and stop noticing that it's small. She didn't believe that anymore. What she believed now, not as a lesson she'd been taught, not as something she could have articulated before she'd earned it through the specific grinding difficulty of actually living it, was that belonging was built. You built it out of the work you did and the word you kept and the people you stood beside when standing beside them cost you something. It accumulated the way the grass in the south pasture accumulated, slowly, without announcement, in small increments that individually meant almost nothing and collectively meant a field. She was not the woman the town had laughed at. Or rather, she was that woman, and that woman had turned out to be something considerably different from what the town had decided she was. That discrepancy no longer had the power to hurt her. It was just information about the limits of other people's attention, and other people's attention had always been a poor measure of anything real. The porch was quiet. Ethan said, "I'm glad Pruitt came to the gate." Mara looked at him. He was looking at the sky, not at her. "So am I," she said. She meant it in the large and complicated way she meant most things now. Not cleanly, not without the acknowledgement of how much it had cost and how close the different outcome had been. But yes, she meant it. Fletcher woke up briefly, looked around the yard with the assessing expression of a dog confirming that nothing required his attention, and went back to sleep. The south pasture held its green in the last of the light. The ranch, their ranch, clear and carried and built out of the specific refusal to let it be taken, went on into the evening, ordinary and imperfect and entirely, stubbornly theirs.